Well, welcome to one of the second panels for the day, Reimagining Mothers and Maternity. We are actually missing our first presenter for the day, but that's okay. Maybe we'll have a lot of time for questions. So I want to introduce our first presenter, Marygrace Hemme from the University of Memphis, and she'll be giving a talk, The Mother as Subject, From Passions to Metaphor in Colette.
Thank you. In The Passion According to Motherhood, Juliet Kristeva notes there are few theories of the mother as subject. For Kristeva, becoming a subject is a continual process of renewals in psychic life through the reinterpretation of experience. This is an important theme throughout the Female Genius trilogy, and there is evidence that these works can be seen as descriptions of the mother as subject, in accordance with Kristeva's definition of motherhood, which is not merely biological but also a symbolic relation in which a link to the other can become love. In the third volume of the trilogy, Colette, Kristeva's analysis of the image of the mother put forth in Colette's writing, which she calls Cedo, illustrates the complexity of this description of motherhood from the point of view of the mother. Kristeva links female genius to physical maternity, but also to figurative maternity, when she states that, quote, mothers can be geniuses of a certain approach to living the life of the mind, end quote. Borrowing in part from Melanie Klein, Kristeva thinks that in order for the individual self or ego to develop, in addition to the physical separation from the mother during birth, there must be a physical separation from the mother which occurs later. It is the result of this separation that a child is able to speak. Kristeva links female genius and maternity by illustrating the way in which motherhood is important to the process of becoming a subject for both the mother and the child by describing the structural experience of motherhood. According to Kristeva's account, in pregnancy, the mother is split between narcissistic withdrawal and projecting herself toward the future birth of the child. Through projective identification, the child, once born, internalizes and identifies with the mother, and the mother in turn identifies with her child as a double because of the destabilization she experienced as a 2-in-1 during pregnancy. In order for the child to become a subject in the process, she must detach from the mother, and the mother must detach herself from the child as well. The child begins her detachment from the mother with the acquisition of language as a replacement for the mother, since through it she can symbolically express needs in the absence of the mother. According to Kristeva, quote, the acquisition of language by the child is a reacquisition of language by the mother, end quote, because through accompanying her child's sounds and creating words from them, the mother relives her own acquisition of language and the loss of the mother it entailed. Thus, she is able to experience a renewal in psychic life through reinterpreting this experience. The mother must also redirect her drive towards identification with the child to other aims through sublimation in the process of detachment from the child. This separation is only able to occur because of this passionate link between the mother and child. Passions are not simply emotions, which all animals experience as the expression of the relationship between body and environment. Rather, they are uniquely human experiences that are both somatic and symbolic because they presuppose a reflexive consciousness, which is, quote, the capacity for an encounter of the same with the other and, simultaneously, of the same with oneself as another, end quote. Language is what makes reflexive consciousness, and thus passions, possible, since it allows us to meaningfully interpret our experiences and reflect upon them. The object of psychoanalysis is the passions, and according to Kristeva, it studies the way that the desires of the body are formed and reformed through language. The passionate link that occurs in motherhood begins to occur through identification. The child identifies with the mother by internalizing the mother in the process of ego formation, and the mother identifies with the child as part of herself, as a double of herself during pregnancy. As stated, in order for the child to become a subject and for the subjectivity of the mother to remake itself in the process of the reacquisition of language, the mother and child must detach from one another. But during the process of detachment, there must also be a relation between the mother and child in which the mother redirects or sublimates the death drive that encourages her to fuse with the child and dominate the child into a tenderness that allows the child to and supports the child during his or her development as an individual. In her relation to the child, she also relives her own relation to her mother, and through this she can rework the way in which her passions formed through her relationship to others. The passionate link that allows for the birth of the child through his or her development as an individual, and the rebirth of the mother through a reformulation of her experiences and her relationships, which allows her to open new connections, is the same process that occurs during psychoanalysis. This passionate link, which is a constant working through or reinterpretation of experience, is what Kristeva calls an experience of love. Our capability to love as adults stems from this initial link between the mother and child, in which the mother sublimates her drive to absorb and dominate the child, and allows the child to become a subject, an other. Mothers, then, are models of sublimation. Kristeva claims that what seems common to female genius, despite the diverse experiences of her geniuses, is, quote, the attention paid to the link and the object, rather than the dramas of subjectivity, end quote. On a cultural level, each of Kristeva's geniuses has established and maintained a passionate link between herself and an other that takes the same co-constituting form as the mother-child relationship. For Colette, this link is between the writer and the reader, though the link is made possible by more intimate links in Colette's life, her relationship with her mother and with her child. In the third volume of the trilogy, The Biography of Colette, Kristeva illustrates how maternity, the creation and recreation of the subject through this passionate link, is enacted in Colette's writing because she uses writing to distance herself from amorous fusion, in this case, the sexual love of the couple, so that she can love the rest of the world by a sublimation or redirection of the sexual drive towards the rest of the world, which occurs through the relation to the mother. Colette's writing and the metaphors she uses in it stem from the way she internalizes her mother as a model of sublimation. Kristeva explains this process by contrasting it to Klein's description of the infant's reaction to the loss of the mother. According to Kristeva's interpretation of Klein, the ego in formation begins by relating only to a quasi-object, a part of the mother, the breast. To form the distinction between inside and outside, the child takes things in through introjection and expels things through projection. The quasi-object that is the breast has a referent in the outside world, but is just as much a construction from within the infant as an internal image that is also made up of sensorial elements. The breast causes frustration because it is not always there, and even when it is, it can never fulfill the insatiable need for gratification that the ego in formation has. In order to deny the pain caused by the absence of the breast, the ego in formation will split it into a fantasized good or gratifying object that it introjects to deny absence, and a bad object that it projects outside to keep the frustrating object at a distance. Both the good and the bad objects are internalized, though, since it is the internalized object that secures and compensates for the external object, because the internal object is always present. Because of the ego in formation's insatiable desire, when it loses the mother, it thinks it killed the mother as a result of its appropriation of the breast. The ego in formation separates the mother and his imaginary and replaces her with symbols through which emotions can be expressed when he or she begins to speak. Once the child has separated herself from the mother, the child remembers the lost good object and mourns this loss. This is called the depressive position. The child mourns because she feels gratitude if the mother was attentive, since satisfaction from the good breast, although it was only partial, helps to reduce the anxiety in the ego. Gratitude and guilt from the feeling that the child destroyed the mother lead to an impulse to make reparations, which gradually replaces the destructive impulses. The self recreates the internalized mother and restores her. As the mother becomes a whole object, both good and bad, present and absence, the ego in formation can also integrate itself into a whole, as the split internalized object is integrated. In contrast to Klein's emphasis on the depressive position, Kristeva thinks that Colette takes a different approach to internalizing the mother in the formation of her ego that focuses less on mourning and depression and more on the absorption of and desire for the mother. Colette wants to experience, quote, the pleasure of fusion destruction that connects her and her mother, and if she must detach herself from it, it will be by saturating herself in the memory that contains them in their common language, which has become a sensory word. And Colette turns depression into its opposite, an incestual desire or perverse appropriation of the maternal. She does this by trying to write the thing that is lost in order to acquire language, the bond with the mother. According to Kristeva, by cultivating language, Colette absorbs the other side of the subject, her other, her model, her mother. There is a turn in her writing from the view of the child, that of loss and depression, to the experience of the mother through incestuous sensuality itself and in relation to the mother. Through her sensuous writing, she observes the other side of the subject she is, the other part of the co-constituting relation through which her ego is formed, the mother. In her early text, the character Claudine is motherless. As Colette's writing progresses, though, she finds her mother through her writing. Once memory becomes the consciously chosen theme, she is able to write in the style that she has been attempting to since she began writing. Kristeva thoroughly describes Colette's stylistic turning point in The Tendrils of the Vine, which, quote, from the outset presents itself as haunted by passing contact with sensory time. Everything is electrical, end quote. According to Kristeva, Colette's metaphors are born from sensory experience of the world. They are not mere comparisons, but rather in the metaphor used is the realization of the change because, quote, they grasp the object names in their sensory impact on the subject and communicate that acute, unique, revealing sensibility to the reader who slips from words to things, end quote. This involves analogy and contrast, a relation of similarity and difference. In this way, a metaphor is a metamorphosis for Colette. The metaphors used focus on an, quote, inexpressible relation, tracing circles and spirals between two things, two sensations, two words, end quote. They are hooked in this way, and according to Kristeva, they are the tendrils of the vine. Her metaphors often rely on oppositeness, and there is displacement in the senses. Eyes eat, sight becomes smell. She projects herself into the plenitude of the senses, quote, to metamorphosize herself into the sensory world through vibrations of the tongue. She loses herself in her sensory writing to find another part of herself. The name Colette gives to this movement of helix and spiral, attachment and separation, that which infuses the self in the other and the other in oneself, like a metaphor, is Sido, the name of her mother. The relation to the mother is one of analogy and contrast, as the child is the mother's double, who through sublimation can become an other. By using her mother as a metaphor for her style, a metamorphosis occurs. Colette, in a sense, becomes her mother. She writes about her mother to appropriate her, which allows her to see from both the child's and the mother's point of view. According to Kristeva, Colette's mother was very interested in the sensual, but she told Colette to look and not to touch. As a result, Colette appropriates her mother in the pleasure that she forbid Colette from having by metaphorically touching beautiful things through her words. Her childhood is regained when she joins her mother in this forbidden passion. She writes the way she touches with all of her senses. Sido de-emphasized sexual love as the object of her desire. Rather, her love was desexualized and redirected towards children. According to Kristeva, an intermixing of identities occurs in this flux between matter and words, and the senses and the words, which Colette calls Sido. Her mother is her model when it comes to writing as well, so Kristeva thinks the writer could be Sido and also Colette when Colette expresses herself in this sensual, metaphorical style. According to Kristeva, perverse acts punctuated Colette's life, but she metamorphosized them through sublimation, quote, by using some of them as self-analysis, by living and meditating on them in her writing, where, in the end, they acquire their definitive reality, a fictive neo-reality, end quote. Sexuality is perverse in its preliminary pleasures and its unconscious fantasies, and according to Kristeva's interpretation of Freud, perversion is sexual activity which, quote, extends in an anatomical sense beyond the regions of the body that are designed for sexual union, or lingers over the immediate relations to the sexual objects, which should normally be transversed rapidly on the path towards the final sexual aim, end quote. Because children are invested in all of their erogenous zones as objects of satisfaction, they are, quote, polymorphously perverse. According to Freud, perversion is a transgression of barriers placed by social laws as, quote, the law of the father in psychoanalysis. Sublimation is the desexualization and deintrication of the drives. In desexualization, the drive deviates from seeking the satisfaction of the erogenous zones to procuring ideal pleasures like beauty and creating things. These pleasures are maintained through representation. They are wrapped up in the imaginary. For Kristeva, another kind of pleasure, another jouissance, underlies the reversal of perversion into sublimation, and that pleasure is Sido. Because writing is a displacement of this perverse displacement. It transfers pleasure from sexuality to all sensations and to words. Sido is this imaginary space itself. Kristeva calls this process of movement from a perversion, a turning towards the father's law, where perversion is sexual activity outside of the father's law, to mereversion, a turning toward the mother, the desexualization of the drive and the pleasure of sublimation. We can see that Colette turns towards her mother and her perversion in the way she captures the polymorphous sexuality of the child within her. One must return to the infantile to write the world's flesh, to immerse oneself in sensorial experience, because it is rooted in the relationship to the mother through the redirection of the sexual drive towards a love of all things. Colette's writing is a way of rewriting the love relationship from the love of a couple to a love of being transferred into words. For Colette, body and word are joined through her poetic, sensual descriptions, and through her writing, desire and meaning accompany each other. According to Kristeva, Colette dissolves into life because she writes in a style that is inseparable from a way of being, so that as soon as the writing is read, it is transformed into things felt. She plunges us back into childhood, into memory, to regain that time and reinterpret her experiences through her relation to her mother. And by giving birth to her mother as the subject of her writing, she is able to write from the point of view of the mother as a subject herself.
Great, thank you. Has our first speaker shown up? Oh, hello.
I apologize, I've got
No problem. Okay.
a little lost on campus. I was on the wrong side.
Oh, okay. She just found the building. Okay, well, so we'll move on to the next speaker then, and we'll get back to the order. So is it Michèle Vialet? Okay, from the University of Cincinnati, and her talk is called Motherhood as a Structural Experience in the Construction of the Feminine Subject, Kristeva's Dialogic Contribution.
Thank you. In my paper, I focus on Kristeva's dialogic contribution to the reflection and discourses on maternal passion and its meaning today. I argue that as a researcher, psychoanalyst, mother, and humanist, Kristeva has systematically endeavored to put or to bring back motherhood at the crossroads of discourses that deal with the feminine, the female, or woman, regardless of the specific concerns of the disciplines they originate from: feminism, Freudian psychoanalysis, beaux-arts, religious thought and iconography, contemporary biology and life science research, and to some extent, cognitivism, Freudian psychoanalysis, and social and political forums. For the past 45 years, she has furthermore consistently seen that the voices of une femme, with the plural, both her own, born out of her experience of motherhood, and accounts of voices of women from her psychoanalytic practice, as well as her experience as president of the Handicap National Council, were brought to this discursive and polyphonic site. I hope to shed light on Kristeva's deliberate use of dialogism to apprehend motherhood as a structural experience in the construction of the feminine subject. I also see in Kristeva's choice of dialogism a creative strategy that enables her to move forward, to move forward Freudian analysis, whose original conceptual framework fails at the site of motherhood, in two areas: toward a better account of femininity and to the center of the crossroads at which motherhood lies, that is, the crossroads of biology and meaning, au carrefour du biologique et de la pensée. To put it in other words, Kristeva moves Freudian and Lacanian psychoanalysis out of the blind spot of the feminine and provides new levels of integration of biology and meaning. Although she applies it to a different context, Rosemary Balsam makes a similar observation in her commentary on Kristeva, published in the 2014 February issue of the Journal of the American Psychoanalytical Association. Kristeva, she writes, simply asserts for psychoanalysis elements of Freud's early originality that she has brought forward in new levels of integration that grasp the significance of the female body, qua female, in the foundational implications of the psyche. End of quote. In my paper, I will refer to three texts, two essays, Stabat Mater of 1976, and La Passion selon la Maternité, published in 2005 in La haine et le pardon, and the short film written by Kristeva and directed by Gaël Labov, Reliance. Kristeva presented this 11-minute short at the 2011 Congrès des psychanalystes de langue française. Reliance is also the subject of an essay, Reliance ou l'érotisme de la maternité, that I won't even have time to discuss. However, in the time I have, I will probably focus more on Stabat Mater to highlight Kristeva's dialogic contribution to the understanding of motherhood. So, point one, or part one. Looking simultaneously at the three texts that Kristeva devotes to maternity reveals some striking continuities. Since Stabat Mater, an essay on the Christian, especially pre-Protestant representation of motherhood, all the way to the most recent text on maternal passion, Kristeva highlights the centrality of the structural experience of maternity in the life of the woman, and more fundamentally, in what she calls the truth of the woman, la vérité de la femme, and the future of humanity. To convey her meaning, she multiplies the definitions of maternal passion. In one of the definitions that recurs the most often, she insists in locating motherhood at the crossroad of biology and meaning. This is a foundational discovery that supplé, and I'm using the French word, Derrida's word, supplé, Freudian psychoanalysis, but also occurs thanks to dialogues that she enters into with other fields of studies addressing maternity. Dialogue, implicit or explicit, is the tool Kristeva uses to define motherhood as a structural experience in the construction of the feminine subject. In a sense, she bets the house on dialogism. Elle mise tout sur le dialogisme, I'm saying that. How does she bring about dialogism? As David Shepard reminds us, and I quote, the term dialogism is most commonly used to denote the quality of an instance of discourse that explicitly acknowledges that it is defined by its relationship to other instances, both past, to which it responds, and future, whose response it anticipates. The positive connotations of dialogism are often reinforced by a contrast with monologism, denoting the refusal of discourse to acknowledge its relational constitution and misrecognition of itself as independent and unquestionably authoritative. How does dialogism play in I need to switch that because I made some change. Two is that Kristeva has what I think is a new text on maternity, Stabat Mater. How does Kristeva explicitly acknowledge in Stabat Mater that her discourse is defined by its relationship to other instances, both past, to which it responds, and future, whose response it anticipates? I would like to highlight three devices of dialogism. A, the explicit interpellation. Let us recall how the essay begins with an interpellation of feminists. Kristeva immediately points to the paradox in which we are caught. Feminism rejects I quote, the image and misuse of the consecrated, underscored, religious or secular representation of a femininity absorbed by motherhood, end of quote, and demands a new representation of femininity. But because of its radical or perhaps too hasty rejection, feminism, and I quote Kristeva, circumvents the real experience and fantasy overshadows. The result, asks Kristeva, I quote, a negation or rejection of motherhood by some avant-garde feminist groups, or else an acceptance, conscious or not, of its traditional representations by the great mass of people, women and men. End of quote. 2b, the semiotic discourse would be the second mode of dialogism that I will underscore. Soon after one begins reading Stabat Mater, the reader is visually warned that the text splits into two discourses that are characteristically different and represented the voices of two unrelated narrators that have little, if anything, in common. The voice that begins the piece runs through it from start to finish on the right side of the page. Discursive, analytic, and didactic, perhaps polemical, it is governed by the first-person plural narrator, nous, and its explicit intent to sort out the paradox in which competing representations of motherhood leave us. The style is expository and the argumentative thread chronologically ordered. The other discourse appears more intermittently on page 2, then on page 8 through 11, then it disappears and reappears again and again, finally ending on the same page as the first discourse. In boldface, it occupies the left half of the pages. A first-person singular account utters words, sounds, concepts, sensations, fears, body reactions, thoughts in rough forms, barely articulated. Occasionally, a full sentence gives glimpses of an organized stream of consciousness that is aware of and inscribed in time as we know it. Later on, sensations make room for emotions that the speaker, the feminine I voice, articulates or narrates. Poetic, partaking of the presymbolic experience of communication, and asyntaxical prose translate the subjective experience that the reader figures out as that of conception, pregnancy, birth-giving, and motherhood. The following translation of a short passage shows how the stream of consciousness also contains within itself dialogic strands that manifest themselves at the level of the word and image unit. And I quote, "Scent of milk, dewed greenery, acid and clear, recall of wind, air, seaweed. It slides under the skin, detaches skin from bones, inflates me like an ozone balloon, and I hover with feet planted firmly on the ground to carry him, sure, stable, ineradictable, while he dances in my neck, flutters with my hair." And this is in English, in the original French. "Slips on the breast, swingles, silver bloom on my belly," back to French, "and finally flies away on my navel in his dream carried by my hands, my son." And here there's an ellipsis that I made. "Smiles in the blackness of dreams at night, opaque joy that roots me in my bed, my mother's, and projects him, a son, a butterfly soaking up dew from her hand, there, nearby in the night, alone, she, I, and he." Bakhtin explains how dialogism begins with the complex tensions and interrelationships that words introduce, creating layered and polyphonic meaning. And I quote Bakhtin from Discourse in a Novel. "Directed towards its object, a word enters a dialogically agitated and tense environment of alien words, evaluations, and accents, is woven into their complex interrelationships, merges with some, recalls from others, intersects with yet a third group. And all this way, in an essential manner, shape the word, may leave a trace in all its semantic layers, may complicate its expression, and influence its entire stylistic profile." End of quote. The dialogic effect of Kristeva's composition occurs also at a larger level, a macro level, if I may say. Although the two texts stand side by side, echoing and figuring the piece's title, Stabat Mater, stands the mother. The relationship cannot simply be described as one of co-presence, with all the complementarity, but also jarring affective differences and reproach it entails. To be fair to this estranged voice, the critic must also account for the dialogic counterpoint, the personal account present to the learned survey of representations presented by the main narrative instance. The use of language, the enumerations, the asyntactical, syntaxical language of the personal account, the physical experience of alterity, the critical versus the critical stance of the learned observer, relationships to time and space, and so on, are characteristic components of what Kristeva calls the semiotic, and you have discussed. We stand reminded of a statement in which Kristeva credits psychoanalysis for foregrounding the pulsional genealogy of speech. And this one I have in French. Ce n'est pas le moindre rapport de la psychanalyse d'avoir révélé à la culture moderne que le langage est une énonciation qui révèle sa généalogie pulsionnelle dans ses thèmes, aussi bien que dans ses vocables et dans les enchaînements syntaxiques eux-mêmes, dont la charge sonore et sensorielle est presque comme poétique. The third dimension of dialogical devices I want to underscore is feminine temporality. One third but important element I'd like to underscore is the capacity of dialogism to restitute time and temporality to language, discourses, and experiences. In an important article published in Philosophia, in the inaugural issue in 2001, Fanny Söderberg underscores the role that le temps de la femme plays in rendering the feminine experience of present, past, and future, homologous to the polyphonic relationships words have, as we have seen in Bakhtín's earlier description. And I quote Söderberg. The maternal body to which Kristeva urges us to return must be understood qua temporalization. To that which we return is temporal, moving, displacing, renewing. The return is neither nostalgic nor aimed at preserving some essential notion of motherhood. It makes possible new beginnings, allowing for a future pregnant with change and transformation. End of quote. Söderberg contextualizes this insightful remark in Kristeva's larger project in the following manner, and I'm going to truncate this quote. By bringing the mother out of the shadows, Kristeva provides women with the past and simultaneously with the future, in the sense of liberating them from predefined roles and positions. It is exactly the future that is at stake when Kristeva speaks of the maternal, and more specifically, it is the possibility of temporal change that depends on it. End of quote. In its use of dialogism to relate the destructuring, the fragmentation of the feminine subject as shown in the quote, and the discontinuous restructuration at work, as represented by the three persons, she, I, and he, at the end of the personal account in Stabat Mater of the experience of motherhood, the essay Stabat Mater prefigures, in my view, but I don't know if I'm right, several of Kristeva's subsequent talks and essays, in that it brings together different voices and types of language and discourses to deconstruct existing monologic theorizations of motherhood. Most notably, it foreshadows the 11-minute short film Reliance that I may have a little time to discuss later. Whereas Stabat Mater brings out the scandal of the speaking body of the female subject in the experience of motherhood, the essay Passion according to motherhood, La Passion selon la Maternité, chapter 5 of Hatred and Forgiveness, invites biology and the life sciences to the table, to the symposium. In this essay, Kristeva models possibilities of a constructive and mutually beneficial dialogue between biology, life sciences on the one hand, Freudian psychoanalysis on the other, and Kristeva as mother, writer, and practicing psychoanalyst as the conductor who orchestrates the moves of the encounter of the symposium. Kristeva's interlocutor is Jean-Didier Vincent, a biologist and friend whose work she admires, and who is the co-author with Luc Ferry of Qu'est-ce que l'homme? What is man? In this essay that Kristeva elaborates the critical significance of the structural experience of motherhood for the construction of feminine subjects. In Kristeva's view, by its capacity to give way to a cycle of sublimation, maternal passion can be understood as a prototype of the letting go of passion, and passion's aids or tormentors, drives, and the object. Not only can motherhood help a woman transform basic emotions, defined principally as attachment and aggression by biologists and Freudian psychoanalysis, through reflective consciousness and language into a relative dispassionate detachment, enabling her to relate to the other. It also optimally helps make way for a woman's access to la vérité de la femme and la vérité de l'homme, while ensuring the future of mankind. I will, I don't know how much time I have.
Yeah, about 10 minutes, you're fine.
Okay. I will simply indicate that the short film Reliance established dialogic relationships with Freudian psychoanalytic theory, including Lacan through the mirror stage and several references, and Hegel, to identify the beginning of her ethics in the real. Written by Kristeva and directed by J.K. Galabov, the film opens on the actual birth of a baby. As Rosemary Balsam writes, we are immediately situated in maternalization of the semiotic kora, a word in ancient Greek that for Kristeva means the earliest stage of psychosexual development of the senses, and encodes the mother as she is and has been possessed by the fetus. End of quote. The second dialogic dimension of the images, music, and the text is the use of the arts. Kristeva uses the different media to interweave plastic, pictorial, musical, religious, and secular representations of the maternal body with the practitioners of maternity, obstetricians, sage-femme, as well as psychoanalytic discourse. Reliance restates Kristeva's picture of maternal passion, not only in relation to the real, but also in connection with contemporary ideas about maternal capacities such as holding and containing. But in the last, well, no, I should skip that. Yeah, skip that, because Kristeva talks about her ethics, but she develops that in the essay Reliance, which is much longer, and I'm not sure I understand it. I've read it, but I've not sure, many times, but I'm not sure I get it. So I should just mention that Kristeva emphasizes the ethical position that maternal passion involves, and that she calls this position her ethics. Okay. In French, it's hérétique, but with TH, so it creates another Lacanian slippage, and that's also difficult. I don't know. It would take me more years to understand that. I'm coming to my concluding remarks. Locating motherhood at the crossroads of biology and meaning, but also of experience and competing representational practices, the traditional, the violent, and fragmented in Max Beckmann's Birth of 1937 and Death, 1938. I don't know if you've seen the paintings, but Kristeva uses them several times. And the media fluctuating representations of motherhood present structural difficulties for theoreticians of all disciplines, for no area of investigation is properly man or woman or discursively equipped to deal with the structural experience motherhood plays in the construction of femininity, or with the complexity of the experience of motherhood. It has been by addressing lacks and blind spots structurally, which in this sentence I hope to have shown is synonymous to dialogically. Structurally synonymous to dialogically, that Kristeva has led the charge to question ourselves about maternal passions, explore, quote, the risk and benefits of the experience of motherhood, end of quote, and, I quote again, try to come to terms with these passions' ambiguities. By inviting representatives of different disciplines or fields of thought in her own thought process, Kristeva has succeeded in convening symposia, as it were, to take input from these while reaffirming the centrality of the woman experience, as well as of post-Freudian psychoanalysis reviewed by Melanie Klein and her and several others. But Kristeva's passionate interest in la passion maternelle today has not stopped at that. Her conviviality extends to all the professions that accompany mothers, as she calls on these to step into the debate in the last paragraph of Motherhood Today. And I quote that last paragraph. My dream is that the arguments I'm trying to develop here will help to remedy this lack, and they will stimulate mothers, and those who accompany them, gynecologists, obstetricians, midwives, psychologists, analysts, to sharpen our understanding of this passion, pregnant with madness and sublimity. This is what motherhood lacks today. End of quote. Furthermore, as recently as March 7th, she accepted the invitation from the newspaper L'Humanité to be the chief editor for a day, rédactrice en chef d'un jour, of the Friday Débat, a 12-page supplement to the Daily. In the column entitled La mère libre n'est pas encore née, a sentence that springs from Simone de Beauvoir's La femme libre n'est pas encore née, Kristeva interpolates her readers in the following manner, and I didn't translate that. Comment serait-il possible qu'une femme, amante de surcroît et chargée de plus en plus de responsabilités professionnelles, puisse tenir en ce carrefour qu'est la passion maternelle? Les religions nous oublient ou font de nous des déesses, mais nos tendresses, nos finesses, nos ruses, notre passion leur échappe. Un processus à nous de réinventer la reliance maternelle du 3e millénaire, un processus permanent d'adoption de ces étrangers que sont les nouveaux venus au monde, perpétuel renouvellement dans la vie de nos corps et de nos esprits avec nos enfants et petits-enfants. Thank you.
We have one more speaker. There is a few chair over here. I feel bad for those who are standing. Sorry, I didn't make that available. And actually, there's some over here. If we can take just a minute while Lisa is setting up. Yeah. Thank you.
Sorry?
So we have our third and...
to switch the screen over to this one. How do I... Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, it's coming up.
I think you're not okay.
Okay, so our third and final speaker for the panel is Lissa Holloway-Attaway from Blekinge, Tekniska, Högskola. And well, she has a title here for her talk, so it's kind of redundant for me to introduce her. But I just want to remind everyone that we'll have 15 minutes at the end of the panel for questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we need to dim the lights at all, or can we? So, Severed Heads of Maternal Recovery, Julia Kristeva, Artistic Rendering, and Moby-Dick. As suggested by my title, my talk today will focus on drawing two disparate sources together. That is Julia Kristeva's reflections on the artistic depictions of heads and skulls in the Severed Head, Capital Visions, and Herman Melville's 19th century whaling adventure, Moby-Dick. So I'll be working to put them in conversation, so to speak, to put together heads, theirs, mine, and ours, and to offer, therefore, a communal reflection on the nature of artistic rendering through the recovery of affective mother memories and tactile engagements. So the first text, Kristeva's, is a contemplation about heads, beheadings, skulls and cannibals, virgins, birth, It's an ode to art making and a melancholic reflection on the maternal and the powers of abject horror to transform, creative memory making to recover maternal materiality. And the second text, Melville's, is a contemplation about heads, beheadings, skulls and cannibals, virgins, birth, an ode to art making, and a melancholic reflection on the maternal and the powers of abject horror to transform, creative memory making to recover maternal materiality. What is it, they ask, to look at a severed head, to contemplate a skull as a vessel for something? Repetition as is recovery is the theme. And for those of you who know the Kristeva work, you know that it is an accompaniment to a curated exhibition at the Louvre that focused on a number of artworks that featured skulls and beheadings and cannibals and virgins and so on. And I'm just going to trust that most of you are familiar, at least culturally, with the short version of Moby-Dick as a text about the elusive object, a whaling adventure for a whale, narrated by a single narrator in the beginning, but that digresses into lots of reflections on various other things. And as we'll see, I'm focusing primarily on those that in some way reflect the head. So let's draw them together. Let's draw them in closer. Let's look more closely at what it is to artistically render and draw them closer. Render them. That is to make their hidden materials visible. What is it to render? To render them and draw them closer. What is it to render a head? Let's boil them in pots in the try-works. That is at the fiery heart of the factory on board the whaling vessel. That site of technical marvel where bodies are carved, sliced, boiled, eviscerated, and hung. Where massive heads are draped over the side of ships and hung with hooks and chains and severed from their bodies and left on display until they can be emptied of the spermaceti inside, the unctuous, luxurious liquid at the core. Its only access is through evisceration, through severing and going deep inside with buckets, bailing the case it's called in whaling, going in literally with the bucket to scoop out the contents of the head. And in Moby-Dick it's done by tattooed cannibals, gay-head Indians, Quakers, and peg-legged captains. But they also swarm the body. It's a queer bunch then, on the case, all over it through the text, from tail to teat to eye, axes ready to render, hands on the body. So let's render this, again, closer, to make the materials visible and draw lines. Massive bodies are hung with hooks and chains and left on display, eviscerated for what's at stake, exhibited, stripped for meaning, and hacked for worth. They're lynched. The work of lynching begins when the body and head are separated by the noose and we are forced to see objection. So let's resist transparency. This is not about pure representation for Melville or for Kristeva or for me. This is what comes before. What does it mean to come before representation? One must consider that the white whale is an opaque surface. It's blank. It's a canvas on which one may draw and a paper on which one may write a personal tale. Call me Ishmael, the beginning of the text. Call me Ishmael, but I'm not. Naming is anti-identity, and it's a mere surface for deeper reflection found deep at the core and deep inside and found in bloodletting. So in the opening chapter of The Severed Head, Kristeva recounts the story of her mother's own artistic rendering. That is the central motif upon which her text is focused. And she tells of her mother, an artist with, as she describes, her fluid natural talents, one who, quote, drew the way that others breathe or embroider. So breathe is an artistic rendering through abstract inspiration and expiration, and embroidering is a rendering by hand. So those two brought together. So in this instance, her mother responds to a challenge from her daughter, allegedly from Julia Kristeva herself as a child, to show how to make thought visible by drawing it. And so her mother sketches an image of a melting snowman, his decapitated head floating in a pool of watery snow, and this image is juxtaposed with one of Earth spinning in orbit, universalizing the small moment of melting with the huge abstraction of interstellar life itself. Small meltings and big movements of bodies, heads and bodies in time. And for Kristeva, this image that captures the transience of the body as watery mass, eventually, is also the persistence of bodies in orbit, but with a hyper-focus on the head that prevails and commands our attention. And she calls it then, this is the capital vision. Mm-hmm. Capital in that it reminds us too of the original disappearance of the mother's body and our attempts to resurrect her with the power of representation of semiotic imagination as a recollection and always as a form of a recovery. So through thought made visible, we make her return. We draw her together and we find a union between the head and the body, but with a focus on the head, and bring together inspiration and that embroidery, that rendering by hand. So for Kristeva, she describes this moment, again, in this very personal voice that often emerges. A body leaves me, her tactile warmth, her music that delights my ear, the view that offers me her head and face, they are all lost. For this capital disappearance, I substitute a capital vision, my hallucinations and my words. Call me Ishmael. Imagination, language beyond the depression, and incarnation, the one that keeps me alive on the condition that I continue to represent ceaselessly, never enough, indefinitely, but what? A body that has lost me, a lost head. So through focus on other artistic renderings of the head, those skulls, beheadings, and other abstract renderings, representations of faces in the exhibition she creates, we are reminded of our deep ability to create moments of intimate contact, to command in presence, in thought, and to connect to the tactility and the materiality of the originary body. It's, of course, a Picasso work, captures all of those. Abject power, presence through loss and memory, inspiration, breath, and embroidery, rendering by hand to make those materials visible, illuminating the process of recovery through the materiality of the body, of the head, of the face. So in Herman Melville's classic American romantic novel, Moby-Dick from 1851, textual representation and technical reproduction, that is the machinery of 19th century whaling, and there's a lot of machinery in Moby-Dick if you've read it. The machinery is brought together through a complex mediation on the materials of art and science negotiated through the recovery of whale bodies. And again, although on the surface Moby-Dick is a romantic adventure tale, is a quest for a whale, it's a digressive reflection on those materials and that source of technical rendering, that factory that is the ship and all of those bodies that come together to make the body self-divide. And so it's a text that has been lauded and massively critiqued for its digressive materiality. So, however, the self-reflexive form of the text, that is Moby-Dick, obsessively presents and recursively represents its narrative, an adventurous quest for an elusive object of desire, the white whale, as a material metaphor for subject fulfillment and for the sacred poetic encounters with semiotic mothers through representations of the invisible. And that's my claim. That is, thought made visible, and the white body of the whale. The whale body itself is described throughout the text as an excessively embodied entity, one that may be carved to pieces in blankets of blubber, scavenged for its seemingly infinite array of parts and sources, and documented in hyper detail. And yet, it remains, like the text that desires to capture it in this 600-page monster, one that escapes simple representational models and practices. It's a material beyond simple linguistic functioning. This is not about representation. It's what comes before. And this is both. It's an initiation and a recovery, a second rendering activated by loss. Spoiler alert, the whale wins, and the narrator is left floating at the end of the novel, described as an orphan in the sea, rescued by the mothership, the Rachel, and that the story is then told as a recollection of that experience that left us there. It's always, it's in constant repetition. So as such, the material body at the center of this piece, the whale, propels the narrative in creating layers of expressing meaning in surprising and disruptive ways. As the narrative and formal properties of the work oscillate between transparent storytelling, as fictional novel and as dramatic play, there's also more opaque forms of representation, which are the subject of its critique is digressive. Bibliographic citation, encyclopedic entries, scientific treatise, philosophical art, object reflections, all of these come together, so it resists identification within a singular genre. And I believe that this active resistance presents an interrogation of its own ambiguous production methods and illustrates how such an allegiance with instability and with artistic abstraction, with rendering by hand and by breath, can become rhetorically powerful. So it does bring us to the hand of creation, and it reminds us of the tactile nature of embodied and embroidered memory. Artistic creations are made by someone, by mothers, for Kristeva at the center of Capital Visions. In particular, in Moby-Dick, we are constantly reminded of the author or creator at work in the text, of the one who renders pages, but also renders whales, boiling them in pots. But we're constantly brought back. The text is never transparent. We're reminded it's an act of creation. It recollects memories and displays them in overt, functional ways. And in the text, of course, I would love to talk about all 600 pages of it, but I won't. Instead, I'll focus only on the chapters here that focus on the whale's head, and there are several of them that occur within almost a midpoint in the text that come one after the other, literal reflections on the whale and the whale's head and the brain and the skull and the vertebrae that are described as skulls and heads, and we go deep inside, and so from skull to brains, it's all a vessel for something. And interestingly, those chapters are told in the second person. So you will come with me, you will see now how we enter the whale, and it's a very personal kind of moment in here. So I ask again, what is it to look at a severed head and to contemplate a skull as a vessel for something? We have to set sail with it, and it fascinates us with its horrifying power to displace, drawing us in a way as it is artfully rendered in detail before our eyes, setting sail with us. So this depiction is an abstract one of a central scene within the head text where the main head harpooner, Queequeg, the Polynesian cannibal, has to dive under the water. There's a whale head attached to the side of the ship, and as it's being bailed, Tashtiga, one of the other harpooners, falls inside the head, causing the head to sink under the water as he's trying to bail the case. It goes under the water. Queequeg dives in after it and basically performs a cesarean birth as he has to cut into the side of the head, and he, he acts as the midwife to rescue Tashtigo out of this, and it's described very overtly in birthing metaphors and depicted here as well. So I believe that all these several chapters in Moby-Dick overtly devoted to dissecting and other subjects of the whale's head, as well as those sections metaphorically aligned with the process of philosophical musing and with, abject reflection in that pure Kristevan way, is they provide an intriguing context for exploring Kristeva's account of the invisible head of the mother and its many forms of artistic rendering in her work. In this work, in Capital Visions, Kristeva illustrates how maternal desire and the sacred human quest to make visible the most intimate of maternal thoughts infuses a variety of artistic representations of decapitation skulls and so on. For Kristeva, these renderings call forth both a fear of the mother, diving under the water, as well as a desire for continuance and self-identification through the appropriation of female power, even when seemingly overwritten by the fear of the father tyrant who threatens us with his phallic power, embodied by the violence of the beheading and encapsulated with so much of the overt masculinist technologies on the ship. So Kristeva's complex oscillation between father and mother tyrannies and her account of artistic renderings as stimulants for sacred self-expression offer a generative backdrop to re-explore Melville's work as a quest for maternal power, masked and cloaked in masculine technical imagery. And I am aware of the irony of the text being called Moby-Dick as we argue for this together. Because as a work of the American Romantic period, the maternal has been accounted for in a literary critical tradition that displaces her, for better or ill, into the essentialist sort of natural world, into the sea and into the bodies of the primitive others and into the cannibals, and the absence of the feminine is then, allegedly re-represented in these sorts of landscapes. But I'm arguing for a much more entangled and embedded reflection of seeing the maternal in this moment of rendering. So when viewed as incarnate in the brutal machinery of whaling, in the intra-active semiotic devices that render the whale into its infinite parts and represent them as artistic process, the maternal forces are ubiquitous and complicated in the text. They are brought to us through a startling technical performance of search and recovery. For Kristeva, I have lost Mama. No, I hallucinate her. I see her image, then I name her, I recover her. Melville also teases us to consider the problems of identity making. Call me Ishmael, but I'm not. I am the in-between of that I name. I am the reimagined body and recovered by the naming of it. The whale body in Moby-Dick is cut, dissected, boiled, eaten, set aflame, and worn, but somehow remains elusive, here and not here. The orphan Ishmael alone escapes the tour de force of memory. And what can we remember of the whale? What is in his head? And why does he desire to take us back? These are the questions that I explore as I work to draw Kristeva and Melville into conversation or to put their heads together. And as I work through a series of other digital interventions that have brought me into conversation with the text, and as I say, I present that sort of small metaphor, or not, it's not a small metaphoric moment, but it is a metaphoric moment that allows me to further recognize how to reimagine the body as a central component, even at the point where it appears to be always under disappearance, or in the process of brutal dissection or evisceration. It may be eviscerated, but it's never obliterated. So I ask, what is it to look at a severed head, to contemplate a skull as a vessel for something? So my current work and interest in Moby-Dick connects the ways in which Melville's work helps us to think through embodied presence in an increasingly digitized media ecology. Melville's recovery of the mother through technical machinery and artistic rendering initiates a connective thread also to Kristeva, but to me, to digital worlds. How in a social sphere where our bodies are continually rendered by media-making practices, by social media, for example, where we tweet, geolocate, Google Map, and Yelp ourselves into being. How can we recall and reclaim our own primal capital bodies in the face of all of this? And how do these digital renderings offer us more and more glimpses into the persistence of thought made visible in a reimagining of what it is to be a head and what it can hold, and what it is to have a face, and how we think of this idea of what it is to be represented in a media world, and ask the question, what's on your mind? So, thank you.
Can someone turn on the lights back there? Okay. Well, thank you all to our presenters. We have about 20 minutes for questions. And if you would like to ask a question, since it's early enough in the conference, why don't we share our names with one another and where we're from?
Sure way to shut down the question.
I'll ask a question, but it's not really formed, so I was hoping somebody else would talk first. I'm Miranda Simmons from the University of Alabama, and I don't know who this question is for even. So just help me think about this. I don't understand how to even talk about something coming before representation or reclaiming a kind of, so maybe this is for you, reclaiming some kind of capital body, but also in some of the other talks too, separating something called symbolic from embodiment, or intersecting biology and meaning, right? And I know that this is all Kristeva, so I know that she's trying to do that too, but I guess I have cut my own teeth on a certain kind of postmodernism that doesn't even know how to talk about something not like isn't that capital B body isn't the process of representation constantly like I don't, how do we talk about thought that isn't always being represented? And in that sense I agree that she's doing something that is complex, that is embedded, that is never, kind of essentialized in some kind of primordial sphere. But I'm still struggling with that. So I don't know who to pitch that to or what, but if someone wants to kind of like help unpack a little bit of like for the postmodern skeptic, how do we kind of I don't know, make a believer out of me or something.
Well, I would not try to convert you, but I would say I actually don't have any trouble at all thinking about this notion of the kind of tactility and embodiment that happens outside of what I would consider to be a more formal representational model. I think that and I would put that into the category of affect, and think of effective and more visceral embodied responses that can't, I don't like to use the idea of, kind of gaps and holes in discourse. I do think of it as a kind of entanglement, but I do believe that there is a primordial sphere. I don't know how I could sort of convince you to think that way, but I don't have a problem thinking about that if I think about it as a connection to an embodied presence that's outside of, maybe to think about it as something that's not always within linguistic function.
Well, I guess my question is like how to make an analytic out of, like it's an analytical question in how aren't we always linguistically representing and thus mediating, editing, manipulating something that you might call a primordial sphere, or something called meaning, or something called symbolic, you know what I mean? And then does that change what it is that we're talking about? But maybe that's too abstract. I'm very happy for other people to ask other questions because
I'd like to address that somewhat, and also Marygrace and Lissa.
Yeah.
My name is Mark, by the way. and I suppose I'm understanding aggression or violence to have a role in the Feminine Genius trilogy, in the sense that there's a move toward language that must first pass through a kind of aggression especially in the Melanie Klein volume, but in a sense it seems that in the progression from Arendt to Colette through Klein, there are varying levels in which our political being, as it's exposed to forces of violence, is explicit. I think it's made. It seems like it's made less explicit, going from Arendt, where the best form of the most effective form of art is the political art, theater, right? And toward through psychoanalysis, which is still a setting of a scene of aggression, but one which for Klein has to result in gratitude. I mean, it drives toward gratitude as a resolution of that aggression in the child's coming to words. But at that point, it's not yet a coming to language in the full sense, because it still remains that we play with words as though they were things. And then finally, there's the resolution, I suppose, is a full coming to language. And yet it's all preceded by call me Ishmael, in a sense. I mean, by a need for recognition and a desire. And I don't think that desire is separate from that violence. And I wonder it needs to resolve itself in more creative ways, in a re-narration of the self that constantly perpetuates itself in a non-linear way, in an elliptical way, right? So I wonder, I'm sorry, I suppose I see that pre-linguistic sense in that violence.
Marygrace, do you want to respond to that?
Sure. Yeah, no, actually, Kristeva has said, and I'm not thinking straight right now, so I'm not sure exactly where, that actually desire is a form of aggressivity. It is a form of exactly what you're saying. So by desiring, sort of in Colette, by desiring the mother, right, there's this mediation between aggression and wanting to also have a relation that is productive, right? So I think that what you said is interesting. And I haven't actually thought about it before in terms of the way that throughout the trilogy, because I've been working on all of the volumes, that it does seem like the aggressivity that is present at the beginning, talking about kind of very political aggressivity as far as talking about things related to the Holocaust and whatnot in Arendt, kind of does get channeled through a series of processes. So that's interesting. Thank you.
I saw a hand up in the back.
I also wanted to respond to your question. In response to your question, I would agree that it is a constant mediation, because I think that when Kristeva talks about objection, she talks a lot about boundaries, right, and limits, and how objection crosses boundaries and defies them in some way. It's what travels through and beyond and within and without. So this sort of sphere, like you said, primordial sphere, this place before language, in my understanding of it anyways, would be a place without the limits of time, and as soon as you introduce language, you introduce temporality.
Yes. I guess, though, that it's like, that's a conversation to have at 3 a.m. with my college roommate, like with a joint. You know what I mean? Like, to think about it's like talking about something being trapped inside of language, as if language is something that is bounded, or that there is a trap such that implicitly you can get beyond it. And I don't understand how we can ever get beyond language. Like, that's my own.
Well, I think they exist simultaneously. I think it's sort of like we have language down here, and that's the sphere
love the pictures that you did.
Yeah.
I have actually a question about Audience, but I would just say that my guess is I'm not, and I come to this conference as a film scholar. My name is Ann Kern, and I, not so much as a Kristeva expert, but my guess is that there are many different kinds of pre-linguistic models that come from the various psychoanalytic approaches that she sort of sutures together, not only as a theoretician, but also from her psychoanalytic practice.
Yeah.
And so there's no question that she finds evidence for the pre-linguistic in her clinical experience.
Agreed. Yeah.
And so, to me, it doesn't strike me as odd, or we can call it the Lacanian real. We can use a Kleinian example. We can, there are lots of different ways we could use Freud's unconscious. There are many different ways to talk about it, but that's actually not hotly contested. I don't think, especially for someone who's practicing. But anyway, so that's one thing. But I just want to know how to see Audience. And I just wanted to ask you more about it. And I mean, this sounds really exciting. I didn't know about it. So,
it's quite amazing because the two pieces, the film for which Kristeva has written the text, which is about 5 pages long with some spaces between the paragraphs, and all the media that are used in the film that match and don't match. There's always some sliding and there's clash. It's like complicated. I thought I would be able to present something, select some pieces, but I also thought I would not have the time because I have like 30 pages, and then I thought, okay, I need to bring it to 10 and 9. So I removed some of it. But the relationship between this piece and the other piece, which is the text, Reliance ou l'érotisme maternel, one has to construct the links between them because it's, in a sense, a lot of the artistic part of the film shows pre-linguistic, semiotic, artistic representations that are not articulated even in the text she puts, but they don't find really the space in the text. It's 20 pages long. I don't understand the text, and I try, but I have to do more. I don't. I think I understand, and I'm not able to restate what I've read, and then there's so many definitions of reliance, and I think she plays on reliance also, and lié, and religion, lié, lien, but not in a clear way. So I think it's a mistake, it's a puzzle.
You can Google
Is it online? It's online.
Just Google maternal eroticism or reliance.
Oui, reliance.
It's 11 minutes long.
It's on the website.
It's,
Okay.
yeah, it's on the Kristeva site also,
Yeah.
and yes.
Okay.
It's absolutely fascinating. And it's very strong. It's very powerful, and I think ça désempare. And it's very welcome, but it has very strong shock value in many levels. And I like it all, but it's still I don't really know how to. I hope there's some people who have worked on it because I'm looking forward to hearing other people's views on it and how they handle it. She presented that at the psychoanalytical meeting of the Psychanalyse de langue française in 2011, and I think it was just to bring in their face the real and the artistic, and to say, hey, as psychoanalysts, we have to look at feminine, at representations that other people, artists, have dared to give. And she gives a lot of weight to the painting of 37, 38, and L'essentiel est mort. And it's a crisis of birth and of death. It's fragmentation, it's violent, and so really stands in shock to the Renaissance, pre-reform representations, and all the other statues of Christ or of women who are veiled with marble, but you see them completely under the veil. It's absolutely magnificent. So yes, we are. Maternal is at the crossroad of who we are and of the issues we have to deal with. So I think she's put it to be in the face, and maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's the director who said, "Could we make a film?" I don't know how it originated. I didn't ask her.
We do have time for one more question. Please.
Okay. I wanted to push a little further. I have this sense of the use of technology in Moby-Dick in your presentation, that there's a great deal of emphasis on technology as a form of violence, or as being both a mode of creation and a mode of violence. And I suppose I see this even in the Feminine Genius trilogy, in the sense that I suppose we could push that work to conceive of the political body, or of political power as a form of technology, of psychoanalytic form or structures as used as violent technological methods, and as also writing and language. And I suppose this I want to combine these senses of the way that maternity is conscribed and confined through technology as something that is violent, but that also leaves space for creation.
Yeah. No, I mean, if I answer again in terms of Moby-Dick, or thinking about, I mean, I really think that's why I have difficulty sometimes when we talk about this kind of pre-linguistic or primordial or whatever, because it sets up this temporal framework that doesn't work, and it resists, and that's why I say the body, or embodied, and going back to those notions of the body, you mentioned biological process, and again, rather than thinking about a postmodern, I mean, I think of a post-human or non-human, or something that has a much more effective, autonomous kind of functioning, and that to see that, I mean, of course, as a 19th century work in the Romantic period, there are set up dichotomies between the natural world and the technical world, and we play with this idea of technical and the whaling ship, even though Melville's trying to underwrite it in lots of ways. There's a resistance to read it, and I just think it's not one or the other. I mean, that I don't think it's, the violence doesn't have to be displaced into either the feminine or the masculine. It doesn't have to be separated from technology and the body, and creation, and all of those. They're enwrapped in a much more interactive process that's not one that you can designate through some kind of linguistic naming. And it's also one that's very performative, in that you, in the act of reading this text, or in looking at, some of the images that you look at, or looking at rendering a piece of artistic creation, that's not something we do rationally. It's a thing that happens. So I don't know, I'm working toward, I don't have any trouble seeing an entangled, a much more entangled kind of processing, where even violence is a difficult term.
And Melville is so, I mean, for instance, those very annoying passages.
They're not annoying. You can't say that. They're the best
Perhaps
part.
annoying. Yeah. No, but
yes.
It's annoying in the sense of being a resistance.
Well, it's a resistance to narrative. It's a
yeah,
resistance to linguistic storytelling, which is its point, and it's annoying to us because we want it to go from here to here, but it digresses, and it descends, and it twists, and it turns, and it goes in all directions. So if we want a narrative, it doesn't work. But such is life.
I would like to add something about biology and meaning. This is a translation into English that Kristeva uses le biologique et la pensée. So for me, really, I think that meaning is more form than thought, than pensée. And biology is also more a science, a study of what's alive, and the biologique is not the study, it's the what lives. And so I think it's English
There's always something
makes more
structural going on,
more
so something
more
else.
choices.
Yeah.
It gives it more form,
Yeah.
more stable than I think she means to do. And to finish perhaps my reply on reliance, I really feel that reliance, the two pieces, stand like Stabat Mater, like the two discourses in Stabat Mater, and the film is the personal account. In some way, it stands that way, representing the body and representations to the discourse. There's 20 pages, but in another sense, another level, and I think it's very important. The film deconstructs the idealized picture that we have of motherhood in religious iconography. It really deconstructs it. Iconography is no longer just these beautiful representations of the Madonna, or Mary and the child, even with a little child that strangles her, in that representation. We have the petit étrangleur, and he looks like he's going to strangle her. And the painting is in Brazil, so it's not all beautiful and peaceful, and it's not all of that. But what she puts in the film really makes the representations polyphonic, and she really creates an incredible layered text of dialogic contestation, piece d'interprétation, connotations, denotation. This is like an incredible piece. So this is what I had written, but I thought I didn't have time to read it.
Okay, thank you all for participating, and especially to our panelists. That's all the time we have, unfortunately.